I always find it humorous whenever we say we don't need any introduction and then we spend however long introducing the guy. So there that is. Hey, I am going to just hop right in and I'm going to repeat some of that stuff and I want you to see some pictures. I think that's going to be important for you to kind of see this. Because it's going to hopefully provide a little bit of context for you. So many of you know me. I know several of you by name. I may not, if I don't know your name, I probably have seen you and can recognize you. And so hopefully you've seen me around. But if not, hey, I'm Lee Wood. Glad to be here. I am the husband of Casey. We've been married for 15 years. We should have a picture of my kiddos up there here in a second. You've probably seen them running around as well, being a nuisance for some of us. Several of you have even babysat my kids, but that is us there. You have probably taken a class with my wife, and I am certain it was probably your favorite class because you were talking about equations or physical science or something beyond me. I don't know. I'm sure you enjoyed it. So that's one of those things that I just want you to know. That's who I am. As Dr. Matz alluded to, this year, 2025, actually marks the 20th year that I have done college ministry. So I have worked with college students since about 2005, in about the summer of 2005. So now, that's 20 years of ministry. And that's something that is really incredible for me because whenever Dr. Matz asked me to preach this morning, I immediately jumped at the opportunity. I didn't even look at the calendar really to see what else was going on. It was just like, yeah, we'll figure the rest out. I love being with college students. And so hopefully you get the sense that this is for you and this is not about you in the sense of condemnation. This is for us all. One of the other things that I want to tell you about that's really formative for me was that I was in the Army for just under 9 years, and there should be some pictures there that you'll see as well. These are from my 2 deployments when I was in Iraq. The first one is there on the left from 2004, 2005, and that's me and my older brother actually in Taji, Iraq, just north of Baghdad. And then that second picture is from 2007, 2008, whenever I was in Iraq the second time. And these were incredibly formative moments in my life as well, as you might imagine, being deployed to Baghdad for a couple of years kind of leaves an indelible mark. So I think that's important stuff for you to see, but we're going to return back to this picture. We're going to return back to that time here in a bit. But what I want to do right now is I want to read the text for us that we're going to be talking about this morning. So if you have a Bible, either a physical Bible, just go ahead and turn to it or tap to it. We're going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. We're going to be looking at verses 7 through 10, and I'll have this up on the screen if you don't have a Bible, but I want to go ahead and jump into our text for this morning. This is what Paul writes for our benefit in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, starting in verse 7. A very familiar passage. We'll get there. Paul says this, "So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, with insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong.'" In this section, we're catching up with Paul as he is fairly far along in his argument. This argument is something that stretches all the way back to 1 Corinthians. There has been this running theme where Paul has been talking about weakness and strength and power and fragility and wisdom and foolishness. And this is actually something that stretches all the way back to the opening chapter of 1 Corinthians and goes to the next chapter of 2 Corinthians. So it bookends everything. Let me read a couple passages for you. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 25, Paul says, "The foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men." 2 verses later in that same chapter, Paul says, "But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise, and God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong." So the very opening of 1 Corinthians 1, and then we see at the very end of this letter that we have here in 2 Corinthians in chapter 13, verse 4, Paul says, "For he was crucified," speaking of Christ, "he was crucified in weakness, but lives by the power of God, for we also are weak in him. But in dealing with you, we will live with him by the power of God." And that's what I want to talk about today. What we're seeing here is this confluence of what seems to be kind of paradoxical things of weakness and power and foolishness and wisdom. And what I think is going on all through 1 and 2 Corinthians in many ways, Paul's trying to have this argument that there are people who think that there are these well-known sources of where power and strength and wisdom comes from, But what Paul says is actually that's not really the right source of power and wisdom as we understand it. And what he goes on to say is where the real source of power and wisdom and strength comes from is where God's grace is applied to the human condition. It's where God's grace is applied to weakness. It's where God's grace is applied to foolishness. It's where God's grace is applied to this lack of strength. And so that's what I want to talk about for us today. I'm going to do two things. We're going to read through the text a little bit. I'm going to make an observation. And then I'm just going to illustrate all of this with a couple of stories. Yeah? So here's the first story I want to tell you. I want to tell you about the most impactful night of worship and prayer that I've ever had in my life. And this is in 2006, whenever I was in college at the University of Arkansas at my Baptist Collegiate Ministry, at my college ministry. And we did a worship night, and we called it Lug-a-Rug. And so we cleared out all the chairs from upstairs where we met. There's about 100, 150 college students in there. And we brought beanbag chairs, blankets, that kind of jazz. The whole point was just to remove distractions. And so we got the stage up there, and we had an intentional time where people are going to be praying, and they're going to direct us in prayer and telling us we need to think about certain things and pray about this, give this over to the Lord, that type of jazz. And let me tell you, I don't have a clue what anybody else is praying about. I don't have a clue. Because what I was doing is I was chilling kind of in the back corner, and I was just laid out on my back. And I remember just very clearly just had my hand like over my eyes because I didn't even like want to like see lights or anything. Because the only thing that was running through my mind was my second deployment. See, I was already about a year away from knowing we were about to get deployed again, and there was going to be training beforehand. I was about to have to drop out of that semester of school to do the training. And the one thing that kept running through my mind is, I don't want to go. I just remember clearly, whatever else anybody else was praying, that is what I was praying, is that I did not want to go. And so whatever happened in that with everyone else, I don't know. But for me, what I was doing, whenever I was saying I don't want to go, is that was me in that moment admitting that I was weak. That was me in that moment admitting that I was fearful, maybe afraid that I wasn't going to be enough. I was going to be in a leadership position. There were going to be people who counted on me. What if I made a mistake? What if somebody gets hurt? What if I let somebody down? What about me getting hurt? What about some other catastrophic thing? I don't want to go. And that night was the most impactful night of worship and prayer that I've ever had since. And here's what I want. I want to give everyone in this room that same opportunity to experience something like that. We're not going to manipulate anything. I know we kind of monkeyed with the order and stuff, but that's so you can have a chance to respond. What I want to do is I want to plead with you to admit your need for God. And I want to just set the stage. I want to show you what that looked like for me. I want to tell you what happens whenever we fail to admit our need for God. And I want to show you what happens and what we gain whenever we finally do admit our need of God. So I want to give us that opportunity this morning. So let's turn to the text. We'll explain it a little bit, and then we'll hit a couple of illustrations, and we'll be good, yeah? So in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where we catch Paul is that he's given a defense of his ministry. And in fact, what he's doing, he's highlighting all these great experiences. He's talking about this man that he knows that has this vision and how he knows that this guy was caught up in the third heaven. And then he could even go on about his own experiences. And he's talking about how he has had these great positive experiences with God. But then he throws us a curveball because there in chapter 12, verse 7, he just kind of throws in there that, oh yeah, by the way, the Lord gave me a thorn in the flesh to keep me from being conceited. I don't know what that thorn in the flesh is. People disagree. Physical ailment, blindness, mental health, I don't know. I legitimately don't know. And at some level, it actually doesn't really matter all that much. The point is that there was a clear, what we would call negative experience that Paul said was from the Lord in verse 7. And so much so that this was bothersome to him that in verse 8 he says, I pleaded with God 3 different times to remove it. And what we know is the answer that he gets is, if you've been around church for a while, is not just no. That's essentially the answer is no, but there's more to it. God tells him, no, there's going to be this thing, this weakness that you're going to live with because my grace is sufficient for you. So this is what I want to do. I want to read one more time, starting in verse 9. And I want to focus on something a little bit different for us. Verse 8 is where Paul pleads 3 different times, and then verse 9 says this. But he, God, the Lord, said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And then Paul says, therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. And I think that there's really good reason for why a lot of times when people are preaching this text, they focus on that first part of, my grace is sufficient for you. Yes, that's good. It's important. Go listen to somebody else preach about it. I'm certain they would do a better job than I would anyway. I want to focus on the last half. And so what I want to look at is I want to see two clear things. I want to see what God declares to be true after telling Paul no, and then I want to see what Paul determines as a result. There's two things here. Let's look first at God's declaration. There in verse 9, after telling Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, he declares, my power is made perfect in weakness. You Corinthians, you college students, you adults who think you got it figured out because you know where the source of power really is, you got it twisted. Because what Paul says, and he's relaying what God told him, is that God's power is made perfect through weakness. It's not through the elimination of weaknesses. It's not through us minimizing those types of things. It's not through that. It is through their present and accounted activity in our life where God's power meets it, where God's grace and his power are meeting it together. That's where real affluence or influence or experience or relationship comes from. So the first thing that God declares is, my power is made perfect in weakness. Real strength comes from God's application of grace in our weakness. Here's the second thing that we need to see is Paul's determination. What does he say as a result of this? Crazy. I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, because in them, that's where the power of Christ is going to rest upon me. Well, let's just be honest. That's not my response, right? That's not what I would do. Even with an answer like that from God, that his grace is sufficient for me, I think my knee-jerk reaction is to say, but can we negotiate somehow? Right? Can we do something else? Because okay, let's deal with the weaknesses, but do I need to boast in them? The point is this. Paul is starting to get this image of what it looks like to experience Christ's power in the middle of weakness and his grace being sufficient within that. And so that's the crux of what I really want to discuss right now. If you're a note taker, I want you to write this down. This is the most important thing you'll hear me say today. I hope this is the thing that sticks with you the longest. It's going to be up on the screen. Here's the main idea. Here's the theological principle I'm trying to get you to understand. In order to experience God's grace and power, you must admit your weakness. In order to experience that sufficient grace and that power that can rest upon you, in order to experience God's grace and power, you must admit your weakness. And that's said positively. That's what you have to do. But what about if we say it negatively? Let me say it this way. You will never experience the sufficiency of God's grace and power while refusing to admit your weakness. Does that make sense? Because whenever we see what Paul's experience here is and what he's been telling the Corinthians all along is that we've got it twisted. We don't try to minimize those things that are weaknesses or things that make us feel powerless or foolish. No, we celebrate that because that's where God's grace and his power actually meet us. And until we come to reckon with that, you're not going to experience the grace or the power in the way that God wants you to. Yeah? And if that's true, well, then that means something for us. I think that many of us are scared of admitting weakness for a host of reasons, but I want to tell you how this worked out for me. Go back to the picture of me from whenever I was in Iraq the second time. So during this picture, this is in 2007, 2008, this is when I was deployed there in Baghdad for the second time, and little did I know, but at the time of when that picture was taken, I was actually already living with what would be a life-altering back injury. I was already living with it. And that was something that I didn't really know. I knew something was wrong, but it was going on. And not only did I know that I had this back injury, that within a year I was going to have life-changing back surgery to help correct it. And then a year after that, little did I know, I was going to be getting medically retired from the Army because I was physically incapable of doing my job. And at the time of this picture, I knew something was up. I knew it hurt when it wasn't supposed to. As a 24-year-old dude, this was not supposed to feel this way. Even carrying around all that weight and stuff, this is not how life was supposed to be going, even for somebody in these radical kind of situations. And I knew something was wrong. But let me just ask you guys this. What do you think I did to help correct that problem? What do you think I did? I did nothing. I did nothing. I made excuses about, well, man, this is a really extreme environment. We're doing really hard things. Of course there's going to be pain. Yeah, I know that I'm younger, but this is stuff that other people deal with, and they deal with worse. And so I'm not even going to admit that there's a problem here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to ignore it. Guys, it took my body betraying me to where I could not stand for more than an hour as a 25-year-old before I sought any kind of help. And in the meantime, do you know what actually did occur? Let me say it negatively. What happened in that time between recognizing my weakness and seeking some kind of help, admitting that, was I became no more Christ-like. I found no relief. And in fact, the things that I hoped that I was going to garner by that experience of weakness was that I was going to be more accommodating for people who were feeling weakness as well. I was hoping I was going to be able to share with them more freely about how they can find relief in God. And I did none of that because I wasn't experiencing it myself. In fact, what was actually happening was I was becoming an insufferable human to be around. That's actually what was going on. Not because of the weakness, but because of what I refused to admit about it. And here's the point. Refusing to admit our weaknesses doesn't just preclude the possibility of us experiencing grace and power and relief and help. It actually is detrimental to those ends. You are not going to experience it, one, because you're not admitting it, but also not admitting it is making it even harder for you to feel those things. So what are we supposed to do? If the main idea for this whole thing is that we have to admit our weakness to God in order to experience His grace and power, what do we do with it? Here's what I want to start making some application for us. Here's the thing I want you to write down if you're taking any other notes. Our weaknesses are the launching pad for God's grace. Those are the very things that are going to propel forward God's grace and His power in our life. Here's the thing. This is where I am. I'm talking to you college students. I'm talking to adults as well, but here's what I'm saying. How about we just make an agreement here? And the agreement is this. Maybe our weaknesses aren't as glamorous as we make them out to be in our minds. Maybe that's the case. Maybe what we should do right now to help understand what else I'm going to say for the rest of the time that I have, maybe what we should do is recognize that we shouldn't romanticize those things that we think are just unique things about us. And maybe we should recognize that as we glamorize them, that's going to keep us from admitting them to be weaknesses. Let's just drop the charade. Let's just stop acting like that's some kind of unique personality quirk and recognize it's actually a weakness because it will remain a weakness until you recognize it as such. Yeah? So, here's what I propose. Let's talk about two examples where I think we can see some weakness in college students, right? Let's be honest. How many of y'all in this room are procrastinators? Where are my procrastinators at? Okay, see, look. There you are. You're in good company, right? I think many of us in this room are just not hardwired to have this sense of urgency about things that have to get done. I mean, that's what the definition of procrastination is when you put off doing something that has to be done either way, right? But you're still going to have to do it, but I just don't have any urgency about it. And that might be a bit of a character flaw or some kind of behavioral thing, but I think we need to recognize it for what it is. Let me just ask a question. For those of you who raised your hand, put your hands back up real quick because I want to be able to look at you. How many of you have said this? I do my best work when the pressure's on. There it is. There it is. Man, perfect. Can I tell you the truth? No, you don't. No, you don't. And I can prove that. I can have a conversation with Dr. Turner, Dr. Garner, anybody you have turned a paper into, and they're looking at it like, this dude started last night at 2 a.m. Yeah, there it is, man. They know. You know. You know. I think one of the problems that we do when it comes to things like this, with these kinds of behaviors, what we do is we try to downgrade the language of sin. and I'm saying, I'm a procrastinator, I'm procrastinating. Let's be real honest. Whenever that is something that you are now not a procrastinator, but you are a serial procrastinator, what's another word for that type of activity in the Bible? Lazy. You are being lazy. Don't downgrade the language of sin and try to hold it up as some kind of unique element of your personality that garners you some kind of special status. It doesn't. It's a weakness. Stop holding on to that, man. But here's the thing. The reason why I think that a lot of us won't actually admit that that's a weakness, that procrastination specifically is a weakness, is because we are afraid of what that admission might mean. We're afraid that the admission that I'm a procrastinator and that I turn my work in late and that's why it's always, low scores or whatever. I think the reason why a lot of us are afraid to admit that we're procrastinators is maybe that means that we're not actually as smart as we thought we were. Or better yet, that maybe we're not as smart as our parents thought we were. Or maybe that admission means that this air of superiority that you earned in no way by not being challenged in any kind of previous academic setting in your high school, that you have some kind of superiority because you showed up in college now and you're getting roughed up because you're a procrastinator. If I admit that means that I've never actually been challenged in my life, and maybe all this stuff is a bit of a sham. That's what I think we're afraid to admit. And maybe it's approaching something like that. Maybe it's not. Who knows? But here's what I do know. Here's what I know what happens when we do admit that this is a weakness. You will actually start to find out what people actually think about you. You'll find the truth out about what you think about yourself. And frankly, more importantly, you're going to find out the truth about what God thinks of you. And now we're right back in 2 Corinthians 12. Where Paul is talking about his weaknesses and those experiences that he's had. They've been positive and they've been negative. However, he is convinced that he knows what God thinks of him. I think for you that when you admit that procrastination is a weakness, you will start to see that every instance of failure, every 2 a.m. paper that began at 2 a.m. and finished at 2:12, right? You'll start to see that every one of those instances are not actually failure, but that's an opportunity for you to grow in real discipline and by God's grace. You will grow in God's grace because you will now be experiencing it more. I think another thing that you will learn is that you're going to start to see that God has placed you in the perfect setting where people around you here will not allow you to take those shortcuts because they love you. Yeah? You'll start to see how gracious and powerful God is by arranging your academic life in a setting like this where you can't swing a dead cat in this joint without hitting somebody who loves you enough to not want you to take shortcuts, right? There are so many people here who love you so much they don't want you to take the shortcut. They want you to do the work. Here's the point. Today can be the day that you actually admit that you're weak in this area of discipline, and you can stop feeling ashamed for always feeling like you're behind the 8 ball. You don't have to keep feeling that way. My procrastinators, how many of y'all feel like you're constantly behind the 8 ball and that you're always beating yourself up for it? Now it's just me. Oh, there we are. Today can be the day you don't have to feel that. But what it's going to require is you admitting that this isn't some kind of useful personality quirk that gives you some kind of special status. It doesn't. That's procrastination. Here's the second illustration I want to give you. I want to talk about passion. I think, because I know the audience, I think some of you are so wrapped up in this pursuit of experiencing intimacy and physical pleasure, you will do anything to get it. You will do anything, even the things that you know are completely off limits. You will pursue pornography, masturbation, premarital sex, fantasizing, daydreaming, just these thoughts that we know are not good. It's not God's design. But here's the thing. Even right now, before we admit that it's a weakness, what we can both agree on, hopefully, is that whenever we are pursuing those things, we can agree that that is actually an admittance, that we are admitting that we actually have that desire. I got to be honest with you, God put that desire in you. There's nothing to be ashamed about for that. How you pursue fulfilling that desire, that's what matters. And whenever we continue to think that God's designs for intimacy and physical pleasure are not sufficient, you will take every shortcut you can to experience it. And until we admit that that is a fundamental weakness that many of us share, all you're going to experience is shame. You're going to constantly think that it was your fault, that you have failed in this way, that it's all on you. And what you're really forfeiting from there is these expressions of fulfilled satisfaction later in marriage, where God has designed that kind of activity to take place. And we're just robbing from ourselves there, right? In the same way that the procrastinator is robbing from future self tomorrow, whenever we pursue these kinds of passions outside of God's bounds, like we're just robbing from ourselves later on, but we're also heaping on top of it shame. So here's what I would say. When we refuse to admit that we're weak in this area, you're robbing yourselves of these things, but once we admit our weakness to God, you will now start to see how God's grace is sufficient in areas you've never even considered. Because you never were opened up to that possibility in the first place. You were so concerned with shortcuts to get to that experience that you never even thought that there could be something else that would satisfy. Right? Am I the only one who's thinking this? Am I the only one who's experienced this? Because I don't think I am. I can tell you that God's grace will convince you that you don't have to be seen as a failure. You don't have to think of yourself as a failure. In that moment, when you admit that this is a weakness, you will start to see that God wants to give you, in that moment, the very thing He's wanted to give you all along, grace and forgiveness. And not only that, you can look in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, and where Paul says that God's not going to allow us to be tempted beyond what we can bear. There's always going to be a route of escape. You don't have to forfeit those future pleasures. You don't have to go down that road. You don't have to submit to that weakness. There is a way out. That is God's power. But you're only going to see God's power there whenever you recognize that this is a weakness that you have. That's the only way that we're going to get there. So, what do? You need to admit that this is a weakness. And I'm telling you, this can be the very hour, this can be the time that you experience freedom from that self-critique and that self-fulfilling thought that you're only ever going to be a failure here. And you don't have to carry that shame anymore because you're not going to be a failure. You're going to be relying upon God's grace and His power. There is a better way. And I'm trying to show you that there is a better way from that. In order to experience God's grace and power, you must admit your weakness. Lug a rug. We're up there in worship. Been there for about an hour and a half, and the room is basically just completely cleared out. I didn't know that, but whenever I got up, everyone was out of the room except my roommate who was still playing guitar for everybody, which was me. And I got to tell you guys, just to put a bow on that story, I kept saying, I don't want to go. I don't want to go. I'm weak. I'm scared, right? I got shot at for a whole year once before. Wasn't great the first time around. I don't think the experience is going to improve the next time. What if I fail? What if there are people who are counting on me and I let them down? And here's the thing. The answer I got over and over, and I didn't hear this audibly from God, but I was convinced that this is what the Lord was telling me in that moment. It will be okay. Okay, God, but I'm scared. It'll be okay. Okay, but what if I get hurt? It'll be okay. What if somebody else gets hurt? It'll be okay. Okay, great. Got it. Okay. But what if I'm not enough? It'll be okay. What if I don't measure up? It will be okay. And I am not drawing a line and saying me and Paul had the same experience. But Paul's language that he uses is God told him that His grace is sufficient for him. And guys, let me just be as honest as I can. I did get hurt. I got removed from the army because of it. A huge part of my identity was now just removed from me. And I got to tell you, standing here today, even with back pain presently, it's okay. It's okay. Not because the weakness is something to uphold as though there's something that grants me some kind of special status because the weakness exists, but rather because I've admitted that weakness and I've submitted it to the one who can now show power and grace in the middle of that weakness. And that's what I want for you. Today can be the day where whatever that weakness is that we've talked about and it rang a bell in your head, you're like, yeah, that's me, or whether it's something that there's no way I could imagine what that weakness is for you. What I want is for you to experience this freedom, this power that is available from Christ. We're going to have the band come back up here. And what I want for all of us is I want you to recognize how this process begins. I'm going to talk to two groups here. I'm going to talk to Christians and I'm going to talk to those who are not Christians. So first, those of you who are not Christians, let me just say this. I am so glad you're here. I know Dr. Matz and the faculty and staff that know that you're not a believer. Like that doesn't hold anything negative against you. I'm glad you're here. And what I want you to hear is that first step of admitting that weakness is not necessarily in just this one specific area. Your first step is admitting that you are weak in so many areas and that you need Christ to come and save you. You are unable to save yourself. I'd call that a weakness. And you know that you feel dissatisfied in so many ways with your life. And what I'm offering for you is that there is a way for you to experience power and grace today and not shame. I'm going to be standing up here at the front. You know the folks that we can talk to. Mario will be around, whoever you feel comfortable with. I want you to talk with them. And if you need to come to the point where you trust in Christ for the very first time and say, I need to be saved from my sin, and that is where my weakness lies, then today can be the day. I'm pleading with you. Don't put it off. And for those of you who are believers, what I'm asking you to do is that as we are going to sing the next couple of songs and you need to be thinking through these things, just because you made that admission at some point earlier in your life for Jesus to save you from your sin, that doesn't mean you're done with this process. You have weakness as well right now. And I promise you, you will not experience the sufficiency of God's grace and power as long as you refuse to admit that weakness. And so I invite you to come do that. I'm going to be up here. You can talk with me about whatever it may be. You can sit there in your seat and just pray quietly. I want you to respond however the Lord is leading you. And if he's leading you to stand and sing, then I expect you to stand and sing loudly because you understand the power and grace that God has already given you. Let me pray for us. Father, I thank you that you have given us everything we need for life and for godliness. And I pray that as we respond to your word, I pray that your Spirit will be here. I pray that you will do the work that only you can do, and that you would make much of yourself during this time. And we ask all this in your Son's name. Amen.